Welcome to day 2 of electronic learning. Once again, I want to thank you for participating in this e-learning experience, allowing us to stick to our schedule and have a good long summer. Nothing should be due as long as you've turned in your source evaluation of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen and did yesterday's work, filling out the chart on page 45 with the notes from yesterday's video. Due tomorrow is, in addition to watching this video, to do a Napoleon case study, and I'm going to have you do that case study through a Google form that's posted on Haiku. I'll point that out to you at the end of this little lecture, and that will also count as your attendance for this e-learning day. All right, so if you haven't already, turn to page 44 of your workbooks. Let's do a little bit of review of where we're at in the French Revolution. Oh, and before we move on, I just want to remind you, if you haven't looked at the calendar for next week, we do have our French Revolution quiz scheduled for Monday, and I think we're going to be able to do it thanks to this e-learning day, and then we'll make sure we review tomorrow, Friday, in class as well. Okay, so we're on page 44 of your workbooks and we're looking at our timeline of the French Revolution. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to watch this video to review the radical phase and get some necessary background on the very final phase of the French Revolution, which includes Napoleon, while taking notes on page 44. And then the practice case study on Napoleon will help you learn a little bit more background about him and his rule as Emperor of France and over most of Europe as well to complete our study of the French Revolution. All right, we're back at our timeline on page 44. Just a brief recap of what we've done so far with the French Revolution itself. Okay, so the French Revolution starts in 1789 with France as a divine right absolute monarchy. And we've talked a lot about the reasons why this type of government was on the brink of collapse in this very infamous year in history. And by 1791, just a few years later, France had become a constitutional monarchy for many reasons that we've looked at. This phase, 1789 to 1791, what we often call the liberal phase, is also known as the First Revolution. If a revolution is something that replaces one form of government with another, then between these few short years, we've got a full and complete revolution. But if we look more closely at some of the events in that first phase and then what happens immediately after constitutional monarchy is created, we see that the constitutional monarchy is anything but stable and very much in jeopardy. So for example, some of the events of the liberal phase, like the storming of the Bastille and the Women's March to Versailles, indicated that the common people weren't going to be satisfied just with legal political change. They needed socioeconomic change and they needed food in their bellies. On top of that, after the constitutional monarchy is formed, the king himself starts to question his agreeing to this constitution that limits his power. His flight to Varennes, his attempt to flee France and raise an army from abroad to retake total control, results in his capture and his execution. And without a king anymore, France simply declares itself a republic. So once again, we see a form of government replacing an older form of government, and we very quickly have a second revolution. And this becomes the radical phase. Yesterday, you heard a bit about some of these events that also make this republic very fragile. So the republic is at war with the rest of Europe. The republic is also at war internally, a civil war against counter-revolutionaries that have emerged. So to take extreme measures to try to calm things down and stabilize the republic, the Committee of Public Safety is formed, led by the guy, Maximilien Robespierre, but he easily becomes a dictator and starts the Reign of Terror. We're going to explore that topic just a little bit more today before getting into Napoleon. All right, so let's talk about the Reign of Terror. In addition to creating new holidays, creating a new calendar, creating new sets of playing cards to try to use propaganda to get people to buy into the new republic, an additional and very crazy tactic that Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety used to help the revolution survive was the Reign of Terror. And the Reign of Terror was designed to root out counter-revolution from French society. Here's a breakdown of the number of people who were executed by the Reign of Terror. And they're all being executed by this machine, the guillotine, which was actually supposed to be a very humane way to execute people. And if we look at this breakdown, we see that a lot of people are coming from the working class and the peasant class, and even a little of the upper middle class as well. There were certainly people of the clergy and the nobility, the old first and second estates, But if we were to simplify this data, we would see that the majority of people that were executed by the Reign of Terror were members of the Third Estate. So these enemies of the Republic were hardly the enemies of revolution as a whole. They're executing anyone who was suspected of just not buying into this new idea of the Republic. Here's another way we can look at this data. So if we look at a spatial representation of the incidences of executions throughout France, we see, according to the key, that it's this western coast, especially the northwest of France, where there's a lot of executions, the far north and the far south, where there are major ports with lots of international influence. Now, if we were to look at this map side by side with a map of where counter-revolutionary movements were occurring, we see there's a direct correspondence. So we can connect that western coast, this inner sort of central eastern area, and then the southern area where most of the executions and counter-revolutionary events are occurring. So we know that the Reign of Terror was certainly designed to end these counter-revolutions and stabilize the Republic. But did it work? Well, data about the number of executions over time suggests that no, it didn't work at all. So if we look at this graph that traces the executions of the Terror between September of 1793 and June of 1794, which is a relatively short period of time to be doing all these executions, the numbers just continue to go up. If it was successful, those numbers would go down. So the Reign of Terror did nothing but provoke more anger at the Republic and more counter-revolution. In fact, it got to the point where the new Republican government, the National Convention itself, turned against the whole idea of the Committee of Public Safety and the Terror. And ultimately, it results in the execution of Robespierre, the guy who came up and defended the idea of terror as a tactic to save the revolution. With the execution of Robespierre, once again, France is left in a really fragile state with a weak government. And what emerges out of this weakness is the famous general Napoleon Bonaparte, who becomes the Emperor of France. And he takes power in France through a coup d'etat. He's a general, he's got a military behind him, and he uses that military to take power by force. We can compare him in a lot of ways to Julius Caesar in that respect. But the case study that you're going to do in a few moments is going to get more into how he took power and what he did with this power and why he's such a divisive figure in French history. To some extent, he was glorified, just like this painting glorifies him, as a great military commander and a man who brought back stability and order to France. But on the other hand, some people see him as undermining the very values that the French Revolution was built on. So the question tomorrow will become, did Napoleon save the revolution, or did Napoleon represent the end of the revolution itself? All right, so your next step is to explore Napoleon in more depth through a case study. So reminder, we haven't done one of these in a while. It's, again, preparing for the final exam as a way to teach you some new information. You're going to be reading a set of sources that include maps, primary sources, and secondary sources, and answering multiple choice questions about them to learn a bit more about Napoleon. You can find this case study by going on to Haiku, check out Unit 4, and then Topic 3, and then you'll see a new subpage called Napoleon Case Study. You can take the case study embedded in the page, or you can use this link to the Google form to take it in a second window if that's more convenient for you. We'll go over the results or the answers to the case study tomorrow, and then we'll explore Napoleon as a divisive figure a bit more. All right, enjoy another day working from the couch, and I'll see you at school tomorrow.